The Middle Ages were an age of paradox, where faith and violence walked hand in hand. In cathedrals, monks chanted hymns of peace and mercy, their voices rising toward heaven like incense. In the fields outside, knights sharpened their swords, ready to spill blood in the name of that very same God. The cross and the sword, two symbols bound together in a strange, uneasy marriage. One represented sacrifice, humility, and redemption. The other power, justice, and destruction. And yet both claimed to serve the will of God. For the knight, the world was defined by honor and war. From the moment he was anointed with holy oil in the ritual of knighthood, his sword was no mere weapon. It was sanctified, blessed at the altar, a symbol of justice wielded for the weak and for the church. He rode into battle convinced that his courage was a service to heaven, that every blow struck against the infidel or the heretic was a blow for God. Priests marched alongside armies, blessing banners and relics, assuring warriors that Christ himself fought in their ranks. The sword, to them, was not an earthly tool, but a divine instrument of justice. For the monk, the path was altogether different. His weapon was prayer, his shield humility. In dim cloisters, monks fasted and endured silence, believing their suffering imitated Christ more than any knightly charge. The cross, not the sword, was the truest sign of God's will, a reminder that salvation came not through domination, but through endurance and sacrifice. To embrace the cross was to accept weakness as strength, to conquer not enemies of flesh, but the temptations of the soul. In this view, the knight's blade was a distraction, a dangerous mask for pride and ambition, while the cross alone bore the truth of divine favor. This tension rippled through medieval society. Was the true servant of God the knight who defended Christendom with iron and fire? Or was it the monk who withdrew from the world to pray and suffer for its sins? In the marketplace and the church alike, ordinary people saw both paths unfold before their eyes, lords raising armies to march on Jerusalem, while monks preached penance and reminded the faithful that Christ himself had died unarmed. The church did little to resolve the contradiction. At times, it exalted the knight, declaring holy wars and promising indulgences to those who fought. At other times, it lifted up the monk, canonizing saints who had never borne a sword, but had borne crosses heavy with suffering. The faithful were left torn between two ideals, both claiming to reflect God's will, yet so profoundly at odds. And still, the paradox endured, because both visions were deeply compelling. Knights offered protection, justice, and glory, the visible defense of God's people in a violent world. Monks offered purity, holiness, and the promise of eternal life, the invisible strength of prayer sustaining Christendom from within. Both the sword and the cross seemed indispensable, yet irreconcilable. The medieval mind was haunted by the image of Christ crucified and Christ triumphant. Which was his true face? The man who suffered in silence, or the king who would return with angels wielding swords of fire? To follow Christ meant answering this question, whether by shedding blood or by shedding tears. Thus, the Middle Ages opened with a dilemma that was never fully solved. Did God favor the sword, wielded in justice and vengeance? Or did he favor the cross, carried in humility and sacrifice? Knights and monks, kings and peasants, all lived beneath the weight of this question, a question that would ignite crusades, shape kingdoms, and fill monasteries. And in the end, perhaps it wasn't the answer, but the struggle itself that defined an age suspended between steel and salvation. To understand why the sword became a sacred tool in the Middle Ages, one must first enter the mind of the knight. From his earliest days as a page and squire, he was taught that war was not merely a craft, but a vocation, a calling bound to honor and duty. When he was finally dubbed a knight, it wasn't done in the secrecy of a battlefield, but in the solemnity of a chapel. A priest blessed his sword, sprinkling it with holy water, transforming cold steel into a vessel of divine justice. The moment fused religion with violence, forging a world view where every strike of the blade could be considered a service to God. The Church, far from rejecting this vision, often embraced it. Bishops and abbots recognized that knights were restless and dangerous men. Their violence could not be erased, but it could be redirected. And so, doctrines such as the peace of God and the truce of God arose, laws that forbade knights from attacking peasants, clergy, or holy days. The sword, they proclaimed, should be wielded not for greed or vengeance, but for protection, to shield the weak, defend the church, and punish the wicked. Thus was born the ideal of the Miles Christi, the soldier of Christ. With the call to crusade, this idea reached its peak. Knights who once bled in petty feuds were told that their violence could become holy pilgrimage. Their swords were no longer symbols of pride, but instruments of salvation. Urban II's fiery words at Clermont made it clear. To strike an enemy of Christendom was to strike for Christ himself. The blood spilled on the battlefield was washed away in the blood of redemption. For a society soaked in warfare, this promise was irresistible. The sword carried a dual symbolism in medieval thought. On one hand, it was sharp justice, cutting down the enemies of order and faith. On the other, it was a reminder of divine judgment, the sword of the archangel Michael, the flaming blade that guarded Eden. Knights believed they bore that heavenly weapon into battle, fighting not only against flesh and blood, but against the forces of darkness. Each battle was imagined as a cosmic struggle, where victory or defeat revealed God's will. And yet, beneath this exalted vision lay something more human. The sword was also wealth, power, and prestige. Knights who fought in crusades often returned with riches and land, their status elevated by the glory of combat. Kings cloaked their conquests in holy rhetoric, but behind their banners lay dynastic ambition and the hunger for territory. To say the sword was sanctified did not erase its earthly temptations. If anything, it made them more dangerous. For ambition cloaked in holiness could no longer be easily questioned. Nevertheless, for the medieval warrior, the sword was inseparable from his identity. To die with it in hand was not shame, but honor. Chroniclers described knights falling in battle as martyrs, their deaths equal to those of saints. Songs celebrated their deeds, and poets likened their swords to crosses in motion, striking down infidels while lifting Christ's glory. The knight believed that heaven itself opened when he rode forth with steel in hand. Yet this conviction raised troubling questions. Could violence, no matter how sanctified, truly mirror the teachings of Christ, who died unarmed upon the cross? Could a man kill in the morning and receive absolution in the evening, confident that his sword had served God? The tension simmered beneath the surface, even as knights gloried in their cause. Still, for much of Christendom, the sword remained not only necessary but holy, a bridge between human violence and divine justice. The Middle Ages became an age where the sword was seen not as the enemy of faith, but its defender, its edge gleaming with the promise of both earthly victory and eternal reward. For many, it seemed clear. God did not merely tolerate the sword, he favored it. Far from the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves, in cloisters where silence reigned and candles flickered against stone walls, another vision of God's will took form. Here, there was no sword to defend the faith, no armor to shield the body. There was only the cross, bare, unyielding, and heavy with meaning. For monks, hermits, and martyrs, the cross was not an emblem of triumph in war, but of triumph in suffering, a sign that God's true power lay not in violence, but in weakness. The early church had long exalted the martyrs, those who went to their deaths without raising a hand in defense. Their blood was called the seed of Christianity, their silence a sermon louder than any war cry. This legacy endured into the Middle Ages, shaping the ideals of those who retreated into monasteries. To carry the cross was to embrace humility, fasting, obedience, and even pain. Where knights sought honor through conquest, monks sought holiness through surrender. Their battles were inward, against temptation and sin, not outward against flesh and blood foes. The image of Christ crucified hung over every chapel, a stark reminder that salvation was purchased not with the swing of a sword, but with the endurance of suffering. Christ had conquered death by submitting to it, by stretching his arms on the wood of the cross. To imitate him meant not taking life, but offering one's own. Saints such as Francis of Assisi embodied this path, rejecting weapons, riches, and even safety itself, choosing instead to live in poverty and peace, trusting entirely in God's grace. Even among ordinary believers, the cross was seen as the truest weapon against evil. Pilgrims carried it on their journeys, villagers prayed before it in times of famine, and kings bowed before it in moments of crisis. To kiss the cross was to renew one's allegiance to Christ, to place trust not in armies or castles, but in the invisible strength of God. For many, it was a shield greater than any forged in iron, a defense of the soul that no blade could pierce. Theologians reinforced this vision. Augustine and later Bernard of Clairvaux spoke of the paradox of divine strength revealed in human weakness. They reminded Christendom that the Church had been built not by soldiers, but by martyrs, not by conquerors, but by apostles. The monk who endured silence in his cell, the hermit who prayed in wilderness, even the peasant who bore his daily sufferings patiently, all were thought to wield a spiritual power greater than any knight's sword. Yet the cross was not without its own kind of warfare. Monks described their lives as battles against demons, temptations, and the snares of the flesh. Their fasts, vigils, and prayers were their weapons, unseen but fierce. Chronicles are filled with tales of saints resisting the devil's assaults, their faith unbroken, their crosses lifted like banners in a spiritual war. In their eyes, theirs was the truer crusade, the inward fight that saved not only themselves, but the world. This devotion to the cross sometimes placed monks and knights at odds. To the warrior, the monk seemed weak, abandoning the defense of Christendom to others. To the monk, the knight seemed blind, mistaking bloodshed for holiness. Yet both claimed to serve the same God. The tension between cross and sword grew sharper with each passing century, as Christendom struggled to reconcile two paths that seemed irreconcilable, one of sacrifice, the other of conquest. Still, for those who clung to the cross, the truth was unshakable. God's greatest act wasn't wrought with weapons, but with nails. And if his Son had conquered the world by dying, then surely the path to him was found not in killing, but in suffering. To them it was clear, God favored the cross. The tension between the sword and the cross, between violence and sacrifice, seemed impossible to reconcile. And yet, in the late 11th century, the Church attempted exactly that. With a stroke of brilliance, or blasphemy, depending on how one sees it, it fused the warrior's blade with the pilgrim's cross, creating a new path, the armed pilgrimage, the holy crusade. For the first time in history, a knight could be both soldier and penitent, conqueror and pilgrim, his sword and his soul bound together in one mission. At Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II announced this radical vision. The road to Jerusalem, he proclaimed, was not only a journey of faith, but a battlefield sanctified by God. Those who took up arms to liberate the Holy Sepulchre would be forgiven their sins. Their violence would no longer be a stain, but a sacrifice. The oath of the Crusader was thus both sword and cross, a warrior's pledge and a pilgrim's vow. When men stitched the sign of the cross onto their cloaks, they carried both symbol and weapon. Their pilgrimage was written in steel. This union electrified Christendom. For the restless knight, it was liberation. No longer torn between piety and bloodshed, he could fight with a clear conscience, knowing that every stroke of his sword brought him closer to salvation. For the peasant, it was hope. Even without land or power, by walking eastward with the cross upon his chest, he joined in the great cosmic struggle. And for the Church, it was triumph. The warrior's violence, once condemned, was now redeemed, redirected toward enemies beyond Christendom's borders. The Crusader embodied the paradox, kneeling at shrines, then storming castles, fasting in prayer, then feasting in plunder, kissing relics, then cutting down foes. He was at once humble pilgrim and fiery warrior. Chroniclers marveled at this duality, describing armies that paused to pray before charging into slaughter, men who wept at holy sites after rivers of blood had been spilled. To modern eyes, it is contradiction. To the medieval mind, it was harmony. The sword wielded not in spite of the cross, but because of it. Songs and sermons exalted the Crusader as the perfect servant of God. He was a pilgrim purified by battle, a knight whose shield bore the sign of salvation. Preachers declared that the road to Jerusalem was both Calvary and Golgotha, where men bore their crosses not on shoulders but in scabbards. The blood spilled in combat was likened to Christ's own, a sacrifice pleasing to heaven. War had become prayer, and prayer had become war. And yet, beneath this fusion, unease lingered. Could killing truly be prayer? Could conquest truly be pilgrimage? Some theologians strained to justify it, citing scripture where Christ declared he came not to bring peace, but a sword. Others pointed to Augustine's just war, arguing that when violence defended the innocent, it was righteous. But still, the shadow of the crucified Christ hung over the Crusades, reminding all that he had died unarmed. Was the Crusader really imitating Christ or betraying him? For 2 centuries, Europe would live under the spell of this union. The Crusades inspired armies, reshaped kingdoms, and redrew maps, all in the belief that God blessed both the sword and the cross when they were wielded together. The paradox had become doctrine, the contradiction sanctified. But the question never disappeared. Each crusade, each campaign, each prayer whispered beside a sword sharpened the dilemma anew. Was this God's will, or man's ambition dressed in holiness? The crusade had united the sword and the cross, but whether heaven smiled on that marriage remained an unanswered riddle. If the Crusader was a pilgrim with a sword, the knightly orders were its perfection, men who vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet rode into battle with banners raised. They were monks and warriors at once, their very existence a paradox, an attempt to fuse the cross and the sword into one seamless identity. Nowhere was this paradox more visible than in the Knights Templar, the most famous and feared order of the Middle Ages. Founded in the wake of the First Crusade, the Templars began as humble guardians of pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Their name derived from their headquarters near the Temple Mount, a place already thick with holy symbolism. But these were no ordinary monks. They swore monastic vows, lived under a strict rule, and devoted themselves to prayer. Yet they also trained endlessly in the arts of war. Their chapel echoed with hymns, their halls with the clatter of steel. To outsiders, they seemed like angels with swords, heaven's own army walking the earth. The church embraced them with fervor. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the age's most powerful voices, wrote a treatise in their defense, calling them New Knights of Christ. Unlike worldly warriors, he argued, the Templars fought not for wealth or glory, but for God alone. Their enemies were not fellow Christians, but the infidel. Their battles were sacraments, their deaths martyrdom. To kill for Christ was no sin, it was victory. To die for Christ was no shame, it was salvation. In Bernard's words, the Templar had overcome the paradox. The sword itself had become prayer. The Templars' story reveals the heart of the medieval paradox. They sought to unite what seemed irreconcilable, the humility of the monk and the ferocity of the knight. For a time, they succeeded, becoming the most famous warriors of God in history. But in their rise and fall, one sees the danger of trying to bind heaven's will to human institutions. When the sword and the cross are fused too tightly, the line between service and corruption blurs until even holiness can be condemned as heresy. To the faithful, they were heroes. Pilgrims told tales of Templars holding back entire armies, their courage unmatched, their discipline divine. To kings and popes, they were indispensable, the professional warriors of Christendom, bound by vows and answerable only to God. Their independence made them powerful, so powerful that they became bankers and landowners, amassing wealth to sustain their wars. In this, too, the paradox deepened. Men sworn to poverty became richer than kings, their coffers filled with the donations of nobles eager to share in their holiness. And yet, beneath the reverence, unease stirred. Could men truly serve both altar and battlefield? Could prayer and bloodshed coexist without corruption? Critics wondered if the orders had blurred the line between holy service and worldly power. Their secrecy fueled rumors of heresy, their wealth envy, their discipline fear. In the end, these suspicions would lead to their downfall. The Templars, accused of blasphemy and treason, were dissolved in the early 14th century. Their members arrested, tortured, and burned. The order that had once embodied the union of sword and cross was destroyed by the very powers it had served. The Templars, however, were not alone. Other orders followed. The Knights Hospitaller, who began by tending the sick but soon bore arms. The Teutonic Knights, who carved Crusader states in the Baltic. Together, these orders became Christendom's shock troops, feared across east and west alike. Their castles dotted the Holy Land, massive fortresses that blended monastery and military camp. Within their walls, monks recited psalms before marching to war. Their lives a constant rhythm of prayer and battle. Still, the legend of the Templars endures. In them, the Middle Ages left its clearest answer to the question: could God truly favor both sword and cross? Their lives proclaimed yes, but their destruction whispered doubt. The Middle Ages adored stories of death. But not all deaths were equal. On one side stood the martyrs, those who suffered without striking back, whose blood flowed as testimony to Christ's own passion. On the other stood the knights, who perished in combat, sword in hand, their names etched in song and chronicle as heroes of Christendom. Both claimed divine favor. But which truly pleased God more, the blood of martyrs or the glory of knights? Martyrdom had been Christianity's oldest crown. From the earliest centuries, believers revered men and women who refused to renounce their faith under torture, who walked serenely into amphitheaters to face lions or into flames that devoured their flesh. Their deaths were not in battle but in submission, echoing the sacrifice of Christ himself. In the medieval imagination, martyrs became radiant examples of holiness. Their relics were treasured, their stories retold, their names invoked in prayer. They had shed no blood but their own, and in that surrender they conquered. Knights offered another vision. When they died upon the battlefield, whether outside Jerusalem's walls, in the deserts of Egypt, or on the plains of Spain, they were hailed as defenders of the faith. Chronicles celebrated them as martyrs of a new kind, warriors who gave their lives to protect Christendom and destroy its enemies. Priests preached that their blood mingled with Christ's, their deaths expiating sins not only for themselves, but for those they defended. Songs painted them as noble figures, shining in armor, falling with swords raised high, their courage proof of God's blessing. The contrast was stark. The martyr's death was passive, the knight's active. One triumphed through endurance, the other through combat. The martyr's blood was innocent, spilled by persecutors. The knight's blood was mingled with the blood he himself shed. Theologians wrestled with this difference. Could the death of a knight, who killed as he died, truly be equal to that of the saint who bore suffering without violence? Bernard of Clairvaux offered an answer that defined the age. In his defense of the Templars, he declared that the knight who died in battle was not less holy than the martyr, but perhaps greater, for he combined sacrifice with justice. The martyr gave his life for Christ. The knight gave his life while taking the lives of Christ's enemies. In Bernard's logic, the battlefield itself became a theater of sanctity. But not all agreed. Some monks whispered that such reasoning was dangerous, that it confused salvation with ambition, holiness with bloodlust. For ordinary believers, both deaths inspired awe. Pilgrims flocked to the shrines of martyrs, seeking miracles at their tombs. At the same time, ballads of crusader knights filled Europe's taverns and courts, glorifying their bravery. A child might grow up venerating St. Stephen, the first martyr, while also dreaming of becoming another Richard the Lionheart. In the medieval soul, the martyr and the knight coexisted, uneasy but inseparable, as twin images of serving God. Yet the tension remained. When a knight died with sword in hand, was it his courage God saw, or the blood he spilled in the process? When a martyr died unarmed, was it weakness, or the deepest strength? Both lives pointed to heaven, but they pointed in opposite directions. One exalted the power of faith to endure suffering. The other exalted the power of faith to wield violence. Perhaps this is why the Middle Ages could never resolve the paradox. The martyr's blood sanctified the Church's beginnings. The knight's blood defended its survival. One was the seed, the other the shield. Both were necessary, yet both contradicted each other. And so the faithful were left to wonder. When heaven looked down upon these deaths, which did God favor more, the stillness of the cross or the fury of the sword? If knights carried swords in God's service, kings wielded them on a grander stage, claiming not only to fight for Christendom, but to rule by his will. Thrones were built upon this sacred claim. To defy a king was not merely rebellion against earthly authority, but rebellion against the order of God himself. And when kings went to war, they rarely marched alone. They carried with them the language of heaven, transforming their conquests into holy causes. From the coronation itself, the link was forged. Medieval kings were anointed with sacred oil, blessed by bishops, and crowned in cathedrals. The ritual echoed the Old Testament, where prophets anointed Israel's kings in God's name. The message was clear. The monarch's sword was not his own, it was God's. To fight under his banner was to fight beneath heaven's approval. In this way, kings cloaked their earthly ambitions in divine legitimacy, turning their campaigns into crusades of their own. Few figures embodied this union more than Richard the Lionheart. His very epithet spoke of courage sanctified by God. Richard's wars against Saladin were not framed merely as battles between monarchs, but as cosmic duels between cross and crescent. Chroniclers praised his bravery as though angels rode with him, his victories painted as signs of divine favor. Songs sung in Europe transformed him into a saintly figure, even though his campaigns left trails of blood and ruin. To his followers, the Lionheart's sword was God's sword, its edge glinting with heaven's approval. The French kings, too, were masters of this holy theater. Louis IX, later canonized as St. Louis, marched to Egypt and Tunis, not simply as a ruler, but as a crusader saint. His crown became inseparable from his cross, his wars presented as acts of devotion rather than ambition. In him, the medieval imagination found the perfect fusion of piety and kingship, a ruler whose sword was wielded not for self, but for Christ. And yet, even Louis's campaigns ended in defeat, his army broken, his cause lost to disease and disaster. The question remained, if kings bore God's sword, why did they fall? But not all kings could maintain such sanctity. Some invoked God's name cynically to justify wars of greed or dynastic quarrels. The 100 Years' War, for instance, was drenched in religious rhetoric. English kings claimed divine right to the French throne, their victories hailed as proof of God's favor. French kings countered with their own blessings, their own claims to divine sanction. Each side insisted God marched with them, even as Christian slaughtered Christian. The sword was wielded in God's name, but its purpose was unmistakably earthly. This pattern revealed both the strength and weakness of invoking God's sword. It inspired loyalty, uniting kingdoms under a sacred cause. Soldiers marched with greater courage, believing heaven fought beside them. But it also masked ambition with holiness, blurring the line between faith and politics. When every king claimed God's blessing, who could discern truth from manipulation? Was God truly choosing sides, or were men merely invoking his name to sharpen their blades? For the people, the king's sword was both protector and oppressor. It defended borders, punished enemies, and upheld justice. But it also demanded taxes, conscription, and sacrifice, all justified as service to God. A peasant might lose his son to war, his harvest to supply armies, his village to destruction, and still be told that it was God's will carried out by the monarch's hand. Faith bound them in obedience, but faith also bound them in chains. And so, throughout the Middle Ages, kings wrapped their swords in holiness, convincing their subjects that to fight for the crown was to fight for heaven. Whether in triumph or in defeat, whether in crusade or civil war, they claimed God's authority as their own. But in doing so, they sharpened the great medieval question: did the sword truly belong to God? Or had kings forged his name into their most powerful weapon? While kings raised their banners and knights spurred their horses into battle, the monasteries offered another voice, quieter, but no less powerful. From cloistered halls and candle-lit scriptoria, monks and theologians reminded Christendom of a truth too often forgotten. Christ had not ruled by the sword, but by the cross. Their words clashed with the clang of steel, whispering that God's true will wasn't found in conquest, but in humility, sacrifice, and love. Monasteries were the beating heart of medieval spirituality. Within their walls, monks copied sacred texts, preserved the wisdom of the ancients, and prayed ceaselessly for the world beyond their cloisters. They lived lives of poverty and obedience, deliberately rejecting the pride and violence that consumed kings and knights. To them, the sword was a dangerous temptation, a false promise of holiness that risked corrupting the soul. For how could the hand that shed blood also lift itself in pure prayer? The writings of great monastic voices carried weight in this debate. Augustine, centuries earlier, had already wrestled with the dilemma, formulating the idea of a just war. But even he insisted war was a tragic necessity, not a divine ideal. Centuries later, Bernard of Clairvaux thundered in defense of the crusading orders, but within his own monasteries, other monks trembled at the implications. Could violence ever truly reflect the Christ who forgave his executioners? Could the Church, meant to shepherd souls, sanctify slaughter without losing its way? Preachers within monasteries spoke often of Christ's Sermon on the Mount, of turning the other cheek, of loving one's enemies, of blessing the meek. These teachings stood in sharp contrast to papal calls for crusade or royal proclamations of holy war. Monks warned that to claim God's favor in battle was to risk idolatry, the worship not of Christ crucified, but of power cloaked in his name. For them, the cross alone was the true sign of God's favor, the sword a dangerous counterfeit. And yet the monasteries were not untouched by the age of crusade. Many abbots blessed departing armies, monasteries donated money or relics, and even cloistered monks could be swept up in the fervor. The tension was constant. To resist the call of crusade seemed unpatriotic, even heretical, yet to embrace it seemed to betray Christ's message. Some monasteries sought compromise, offering prayers for knights rather than joining them, interceding for their souls while keeping their own hands clean of blood. But not all were content with compromise. Radical voices rose, denouncing holy wars as blasphemy. Some mystics claimed visions in which Christ lamented the violence done in his name, reminding his followers that his kingdom was not of this world. Others insisted that the truest way to serve God was not to march eastward, but to serve the poor, to heal the sick, to forgive enemies. In their eyes, every monastery was a battlefield of the Spirit. Every prayer a weapon against sin and evil far more potent than any knight's blade. For the common people, these voices offered a counterpoint to the thundering sermons of crusade preachers. A villager might see his lord ride east under the banner of the cross, but he also heard his local abbot warn of pride, greed, and the dangers of war. Both claimed to speak for God. Both painted different visions of holiness. And so, ordinary believers were left torn between two worlds, the roaring armies of kings and the quiet prayers of monks. The monasteries could not silence the swords, but they preserved an alternative vision of God's will, a vision rooted in peace, sacrifice, and love. In their hymns and writings, they kept alive the reminder that the cross had conquered the world not through bloodshed, but through suffering. Their voices did not always prevail, but they remained a thorn in the side of kings and knights, a whisper of conscience in an age deafened by war. All across medieval Europe, the tension between the sword and the cross was more than a theological debate. It was a lived reality. The knight and the monk, the battlefield and the cloister, represented two competing visions of how to serve God. One proclaimed that holiness was found in courage, honor, and the defense of Christendom with steel. The other whispered that salvation was won in silence, humility, and the willing endurance of suffering. Together, These ideals shaped a society constantly wrestling with itself, never fully able to resolve which path heaven favored. In villages, the contradiction was visible. A lord might summon his men to war, riding out under banners emblazoned with crosses, while the local monastery held vigils for peace. A peasant might see his son march off with sword in hand, promised forgiveness and eternal life for fighting in a crusade, while another son joined the monastery, giving up violence altogether. Both believed they served God. Both believed they held the truer calling. And yet, their lives seemed to move in opposite directions, one toward blood, the other toward prayer. The cultural imagination reflected this divide. Songs of chivalry praised knights who defended widows, orphans, and the church, their swords sanctified by noble purpose. Chronicles glorified crusaders who fell in battle, painting them as martyrs of a new kind. But at the same time, hagiographies of saints celebrated monks and hermits who never wielded a weapon, who conquered sin through fasting, prayer, and visions of heaven. In manuscripts illuminated with gold, one page might show Saint George slaying a dragon with a spear, while the next depicted Saint Francis embracing poverty and peace. Both were heroes. Both were holy. Yet their holiness spoke two different languages. The struggle reached even into the hearts of kings and nobles. A monarch might ride as a crusader, convinced that God's justice shone through his campaigns. Yet in his final days, he often sought the comfort of monks, confessing sins, donating lands to monasteries, and begging for prayers. Knights who had lived by the sword often ended their lives as penitents, laying down arms, donning robes, and taking the cross not as a weapon, but as a symbol of surrender. In the twilight of life, the ideals of the cloister often eclipsed the glory of the battlefield. Yet the battlefield never ceased to claim its due. Wars did not wait for prayers, and Europe was a land of ceaseless conflict. Feudal disputes, dynastic struggles, crusades east and west. The sword was indispensable for survival. To deny its use entirely seemed naive, even dangerous, and so society tried to balance the two. Bishops blessed armies while preaching peace. Kings built monasteries while waging wars. Knights endowed abbeys as penance for bloodshed. The clash of ideals did not cancel one another out. They existed in constant tension, shaping a culture both devout and violent. But this tension came at a cost. Every sermon that blessed war seemed to contradict Christ's command to love enemies. Every monk's insistence on peace seemed to leave the faithful vulnerable to conquest. And so the medieval conscience wavered, torn between admiration for the warrior's courage and reverence for the monk's sacrifice. Neither side fully triumphed, because both carried a truth that the other lacked. The knight reminded the world that faith must sometimes be defended. The monk reminded it that faith without love was hollow. In this clash of ideals lay the essence of medieval spirituality, a restless search for God's true will in a world of danger and hope. Perhaps it was not meant to be resolved. Perhaps the paradox was itself the lesson, that God's mystery was too vast to be confined to either the sword or the cross, too profound to be captured by one path alone. And so Christendom lived within the tension, striving for balance but never finding peace, caught forever between the blade and the crucifix. At the heart of the medieval age, beneath the banners of crusaders and the shadows of monasteries, one question lingered like a ghost. Did God favor the sword, or did he favor the cross? Centuries of struggle had offered no clear answer, only contradictions written in blood and prayer. Kings claimed his blessing for their wars, monks declared his love was found only in peace, and the people stood between them, torn by two visions of the same God. The case for the sword was compelling. Without it, Christendom might not have survived. Raiders, invaders, and rival faiths pressed constantly at its borders. Knights defended the weak, enforced order, and carried the cross into distant lands. Their courage was not only admired but necessary. To the warrior, the sword was God's chosen tool for justice, the shield that protected the faithful from chaos. Without it, Europe might have been overrun, and the Church silenced beneath foreign rule. In this sense, the sword seemed indispensable, a hard, shining grace sent to guard Christendom. And yet the case for the cross was equally powerful. Christ himself had carried no blade. He had conquered not with steel, but with sacrifice, his death on Calvary echoing through every monastery and chapel. The martyrs who followed him had shed their own blood without resistance, proving that love was stronger than violence, that weakness in the world's eyes could be strength in God's. The monks who renounced power and embraced poverty proclaimed by their lives that the cross, not the sword, was the truest path to holiness. History itself testified to both truths. Crusades, fought in God's name, won glorious victories, but also birthed betrayals, greed, and rivers of blood. Monasteries preserved wisdom, nurtured peace, and lifted prayers, yet their voices could not stop armies from marching. Each path carried light and shadow, each reflected a part of the divine mystery, but never the whole. The sword brought protection, but also corruption. The cross brought purity, but also vulnerability. Together, they revealed the tension of a faith that longed for heaven, but lived in a violent world. For the medieval soul, perhaps the paradox was itself the answer. God was not bound to the sword or to the cross alone. He was the Lord of hosts, commanding armies of angels, yet also the suffering servant nailed to wood. He was both lion and lamb, conqueror and sacrifice. In his mystery, both sword and cross could find meaning, though neither could claim him fully. The knight and the monk, so opposed, were both seeking to serve the same God, each through the only means they understood. And yet, as the centuries passed, doubt crept in. Was it possible that men had mistaken their own ambitions for God's will, their own thirst for power for his justice? Was the sword ever truly holy, or was it merely sanctified after the fact, its victories declared divine only because they were convenient? Was the cross perhaps the harder, truer way, the way less traveled, less triumphant, but closer to the Christ who had died unarmed? These questions gnawed at the medieval conscience and still haunt history today. The Middle Ages never resolved the dilemma, and perhaps it was not meant to be resolved. The tension between the sword and the cross was not only a conflict of symbols, it was the reflection of humanity's eternal struggle between power and sacrifice, justice and mercy, force and love. In that struggle, medieval society revealed not only its faith but its frailty, its longing for God's will amid the chaos of the world. So, did God favor the sword or the cross? The chronicles do not say, for history is too tangled to give one answer. Perhaps he favored both, in different ways, for different times. Or perhaps he favored neither, leaving men to wrestle with their own conscience, their own contradictions. What is certain is this. The question itself defined the Middle Ages, shaping its wars, its prayers, its kings, its saints. And in asking it, medieval man revealed his deepest truth, that he longed to know which path truly led to God.